The world, for her, was often a series of corners. Not the sharp, geometric kind you might find in a textbook, but the soft, shadowed spaces where a person could almost disappear. Tonight, her corner was a vinyl-upholstered booth in the back of a place called the Gilded Mug, a name that promised far more elegance than it delivered. The vinyl was cracked in a dozen places, and a faint, sticky film clung to the surface of the table, a souvenir from 1,000 spilled drinks. She didn't mind. The stickiness was part of the camouflage, another layer that helped her blend into the background. She sat with her shoulders slightly curved inward, posture she had perfected over decades of practice. It made her smaller, less of a target. Her hands were wrapped around a cold glass of soda, the condensation dampening her palms. The ice cubes clinked softly, a tiny private rhythm in the overwhelming symphony of noise that filled the room. She had chosen soda deliberately. Alcohol was a solvent. It dissolved the careful walls she built around herself, leaving her feeling raw and exposed. In a place like this, exposure was a dangerous thing. Across from her, her coworker, a woman whose energy was a stark contrast to her own, was practically vibrating with life. The woman had a laugh that could cut through the din, a bright, sharp sound that made people turn their heads. She waved her hands as she spoke, painting pictures in the air, her jewelry catching the low, dim light of the pub. She was telling a story about something that had happened at the office, a tale of a misplaced file and a grumpy supervisor. The woman found it hilarious. She offered a smile, a small, polite curve of her lips that didn't quite reach her eyes. She hoped it was enough. It usually was. "You're not even listening, are you?" her friend said, but her tone was playful, not accusatory. She reached over and patted her hand. "Oh, you. I'm going to get you out of that shell one of these days. It's for your own good." She didn't respond. What was there to say? That her shell wasn't a prison, but a home. That the thought of being out of it felt less like liberation and more like being flayed alive. She just took a sip of her soda, the cold bubbles a brief, sharp distraction. She loved her friend. She truly did. She admired the way the woman moved through the world, so sure of her place in it. But she also knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that her friend would never understand the sheer, physical effort it took for her to be here, in this noisy, crowded room. Pretending to be a normal person, her gaze drifted past her friend. Taking in the rest of the Gilded Mug, it was the kind of place that was always busy. A local institution fueled by cheap beer and the desperate need for connection. The air was thick with the smell of fried food, stale cigarette smoke that clung to the curtains despite the ban, and the sweet, cloying scent of fruity cocktails. The lighting was low, a strategic choice designed to make everyone look a little better, a little more mysterious. It just made the shadows deeper, more inviting. She felt a pull towards them, a longing to be standing in the dark corners by the dartboards, invisible and ignored. The main source of the noise was a small stage at the far end of the room, bathed in a single harsh spotlight. Tonight was open mic night, a tradition that was less about discovering new talent and more about public humiliation. A spectacle the patrons lapped up with gusto. A man in a tight-fitting polo shirt was on stage now, growling his way through a classic rock song. He was hopelessly off-key, his voice cracking on the high notes, but he performed with the confidence of a superstar. The crowd loved it. They cheered and whistled, their faces flushed with drink and amusement. They weren't cheering for the music. They were cheering for the bravery, or perhaps the foolishness, of the person on stage. They were a pack, and they loved a good show, no matter the quality. She watched them, a silent anthropologist studying a foreign tribe. She saw a group of women near the bar, their heads thrown back in laughter, their arms linked together. She saw an old man sitting alone, slowly nursing a beer, his eyes fixed on the television screen above the bar where a sports game played on mute. She saw couples leaning in close, whispering secrets to each other over the thumping bass of the terrible music. All of them were part of it, connected by the shared air, the shared noise. She was separate, an observer behind a pane of glass. It was a lonely feeling, but it was also a safe one. To be part of the crowd meant you could be seen, and being seen was the first step toward being chosen. On stage, The man finished his song with a final guttural scream and a dramatic pose. The crowd erupted, a wave of applause and drunken shouts. He bowed deeply, basking in the attention, and then made his way off the stage. High-fiving his friends on the way back to his table, the host of the evening, a man with a slicked-back ponytail and a voice that was way too loud for the microphone he was using, hopped back onto the small platform. All right, settle down, you beautiful animals," he boomed, his voice feedbacking slightly. "Give it up for Gary, everybody. What a performance. What a rock god." The host had a manic energy, a wide, toothy grin that didn't quite warm his eyes. He was a predator, but a charming one. He fed on the energy of the room, and he knew exactly how to work the crowd into a frenzy. Who's next? Who's ready to grace this hallowed stage and share their gift with us? Don't be shy. We're all friends here. She knew that was a lie. They weren't all friends. They were an audience, waiting for the next piece of entertainment. She shrank down a little further into her booth, willing herself to become part of the cracked vinyl. Her friend was nudging her under the table. "Go on," she whispered, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "You should do it." A cold dread washed over her. She shot her friend a look of pure panic, shaking her head almost imperceptibly. It was a joke, of course. Her friend had to know it was a joke. There was no way she could ever. The host's eyes, small and dark and surprisingly sharp, began to scan the room. He was looking for his next victim. He skipped over the large groups, the boisterous tables. They were too easy, too willing. He was hunting for something else, someone who would provide a different kind of entertainment, the kind of fun that came from watching someone squirm. His gaze swept past the bar, past the tables of laughing couples, past the old man by the TV, and then it stopped. It landed on her, in her dark corner. Her little bubble of safety, she had felt invisible. But the spotlight, which had been resting on the empty stage, suddenly swung across the room with a lazy, searching hum. It hit her table like a physical blow, a sudden blinding wall of white light. She flinched, raising a hand to shield her eyes. The noise in the room seemed too quiet for a moment. A lull in the conversation as dozens of heads turned to see what the spotlight had found. Well, the host's voice echoed through the pub, amplified and triumphant. "What have we here?" A lovely lady hiding in the back. "Let's get some light on her." The spotlight seemed to get even brighter, hotter. She could feel the heat on her face. Her heart, which had been beating a steady, anxious rhythm, began to pound against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every eye in the place was on her. She could feel their collective gaze, a physical weight pressing down on her. She was no longer in the corner. She was the center of the universe, and it was terrifying. The world, which had been a dull, muffled background of noise just moments before, now snapped into a horrifyingly sharp focus. The spotlight was a physical thing, a solid column of heat and pressure that pinned her to the cracked vinyl of her seat. It bleached the color from everything, turning her friend's concerned face into a pale mask and the dark wood of the table into a washed-out gray. The host's voice, amplified and metallic, seemed to come from inside her own head, echoing in the hollow space where her thoughts used to be. "Well, don't be shy now. Come on up here," he boomed, his grin widening as he soaked in the crowd's reaction. A ripple of laughter spread through the pub, a sound that was not unkind, but was far from gentle. It was the laughter of people who had had a few drinks and were delighted by the unexpected drama unfolding before them. They were an audience, and she was the main attraction. Her friend, seeing the panic in her eyes, gave her what she probably thought was an encouraging nudge. "Go on," she whispered again, her voice a conspiratorial hiss. "It'll be a laugh." The word landed like a stone in her stomach. There was nothing funny about this. This was a nightmare, the kind she used to have as a child, where she would show up to school and realize she had forgotten to put on her clothes. This was that same feeling of exposure, of being utterly and completely vulnerable, magnified by 100 staring eyes and a single, unforgiving light. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic, wild drumbeat that everyone in the room must surely be able to hear. Her palms were slick with sweat, and the glass in her hand suddenly felt slippery, as if it might slide from her grasp and shatter on the floor, creating even more of a scene. She shook her head, a tiny, almost imperceptible gesture. It was all she could manage. Her throat felt tight, as if she were wearing an invisible collar. Speaking was impossible. Even breathing was a struggle. The host, however, was an expert at reading a room, and he knew how to interpret that small, desperate movement. "Oh, we have a modest one, folks," he declared, turning to the crowd as if sharing a juicy secret. "She thinks she can hide from us in the corner. But we found you. We found you." A few people in the crowd whooped and clapped. A man at a nearby table, his face red and shiny from drink, shouted, "Get her up! Get her up!" The chant was taken up by a few others, a scattered, disorderly chorus that made her skin crawl. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor and into the cool, dark earth below. Her friend was still trying to help. "Just one song," she pleaded, her voice low and urgent. "A short one. Think of how proud you'll be. You can do this." But she couldn't. She couldn't do this. The thought of walking through that sea of faces, of climbing those 3 steps onto the stage, of taking that microphone, it was more than just unpleasant. It was a violation. It was a forceful tearing away of the protective layers she had so carefully wrapped around herself for years. To them, it was a bit of fun. To her, it was a kind of death. The host leaned into the microphone, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow even louder than his shout. "Come on now, beautiful. Don't leave us hanging. What's your name? Tell everyone your name." He held the microphone out in her direction, a gesture that was both an invitation and a command. The spotlight seemed to intensify, burning her retinas. She could see the dust motes dancing in its beam, tiny, frantic specks mirroring the panic inside her. She just stared at the microphone, her lips sealed shut. Her name was a sacred thing, a private thing. To give it to this man, to this room, felt like a surrender. Okay, we'll call you the mystery woman of the gilded mug," he announced, turning back to his adoring public. "But she has to sing. It's the rules. You can't just sit in a corner and look that interesting and not share something with the rest of us. It's just not polite." The crowd laughed again, a little louder this time. They were on his side. They were always on the side of the noise, the spectacle, the person with the microphone. He had them in the palm of his hand. And he was using that power to crush her. She felt a wave of something cold and dark wash over her. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was a flicker of anger, a deep, resentful rage at the host, at the crowd, at her friend, at the entire world that demanded she be something she was not. Why couldn't they just leave her alone? Why was her quietness seen as a flaw to be fixed, a challenge to be overcome? She wasn't hurting anyone by sitting in her corner. She was just existing. But in a world like this, simple, quiet existence wasn't enough. You had to perform. You had to participate. You had to give them a show. The host, sensing that his charm wasn't working, decided to change tactics. He looked out at the crowd, a mock pout on his face. "Folks, she's being shy. She needs a little encouragement. I think we need to help her out. What do you say?" He didn't even have to finish the sentence. The idea was already planted. The man who had shouted before started it off. He cupped his hands around his mouth and bellowed, "Sing, sing, sing." It was a crude, aggressive chant, but it was effective. A few others joined in, then a few more. The sound grew, filling the room, a rhythmic, demanding pulse. It was her friend who changed the chant. She probably thought it was a clever personal touch. She leaned forward, her face illuminated by the harsh light, and shouted, "Eleanor. Leonor." The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. Her name. Her private, quiet name was now being used as a weapon, a tool to force her out of her shell. The crowd, delighted to have a specific target, latched onto it immediately. "Leonor? Leonor. Leonor." The sound was a physical force, pushing against her, surrounding her, squeezing the air from her lungs. It was no longer a request. It was a demand. A command. The entire room had become a single entity, a monster with 100 voices, all of them calling for her. She looked at her friend, her eyes wide with a desperate, pleading agony, but her friend just smiled back, oblivious, caught up in the excitement of the moment. She thought this was helping. The chant went on and on. It felt like an eternity. Each repetition of her name was a hammer blow against her will. She could feel her resolve crumbling, turning to dust. She looked around the room, but the faces were just a blur of shadow and light. All of them turned toward her, all of them wanting something from her that she could not give. The door seemed a million miles away. Running would only make it worse. It would turn her from a reluctant participant into a spectacle, a story they would tell for weeks. Remember that woman who just ran out of here crying? There was no escape. There was no way out. The pressure was too immense, the noise too loud, the light too bright. She was trapped. And in that moment of complete and utter defeat, something inside her just broke. It wasn't a loud snap, but a quiet, final giving way. The fight was over. She had lost. She stopped shaking. A strange calm settled over her, a cold, heavy stillness. It was the calm of a prisoner who has been led to the gallows and knows there is no point in struggling anymore. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the first full breath she had taken since the spotlight found her. Then, slowly, deliberately, she nodded. It was a single, almost imperceptible movement of her head, but the host saw it. His face lit up in triumph. Yes, there she is, folks. Give it up for the mystery woman, Eleanor. The pub erupted in a roar of applause and cheers. They had won. They had broken her, and they were thrilled. Her friend beamed, squeezing her arm. I knew you could do it. Eleanor didn't look at her. She just stared straight ahead at the small, brightly lit stage that now seemed like the end of the world. She pushed her glass of soda away. It was no longer needed. The liquid courage was not for her. She was going into this battle completely unarmed. She placed her trembling hands on the table and pushed herself to a standing position. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, but they held her. The journey of perhaps only 30 feet was about to begin. The 30 feet from her booth to the stage felt like a journey across a vast hostile continent. Each step was a negotiation. The floor, sticky with spilled beer and regret, seemed to grab at the soles of her shoes, trying to hold her back. But the force of the crowd's will was stronger, a physical current pushing her forward. The world had narrowed to a tunnel, with the blinding spotlight at the end. The faces on either side were a blur of flushed skin and white teeth. Some smiling, some shouting encouragement that felt like mockery. She kept her eyes fixed on the stage, on the 3 wooden steps that led up to it. They were her only destination. She could feel the host's eyes on her. A predatory gaze that was both triumphant and a little bored, as if he had already won and was now just waiting for the prize to be delivered. He had moved to the side of the stage, leaning against a speaker, his arms crossed over his chest. He was enjoying this, enjoying the power he wielded, the way he could pluck a person from obscurity and put them on display for the amusement of the masses. He was a king, and this was his court, and she was the jester they were all waiting to laugh at as she neared the front. A man reached out and patted her on the back, a gesture that was meant to be supportive, but felt like a brand. You can do it, love, he slurred, his breath hot and sour. She flinched, but didn't break her stride. Finally, she was at the base of the stage. The steps were steep, painted a chipped black. She placed a hand on the cool metal railing and pulled herself up, one step at a time. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else, heavy and uncooperative. When she reached the top, the world tilted. The stage was higher than it looked from below, and the lights were even brighter. She could see the dust motes dancing in the beams. Could smell the faint electric scent of the wiring and the old, musty smell of the heavy red curtains that framed the stage. The host sauntered over to her, his microphone in hand. He had a practiced, sympathetic look on his face, the kind a vet might give a nervous cat before giving it a shot. There she is, everyone. Eleanor. The crowd roared its approval. He leaned in close to her, his voice a low, confidential murmur that only she could hear over the din. Just pick something easy, you know? A little ABBA, maybe? Something everyone can sing along to. They'll love it. Just have fun with it, he winked, a quick dismissive gesture. He was already scripting her performance, turning her into a caricature before she had even sung a note. She didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the microphone stand, a simple black metal pole with a rounded top. It looked both menacing and like the only solid thing in the universe. She reached out and wrapped her fingers around it. The metal was cold and smooth. It felt real. It was an anchor in the sea of chaos that was the gilded mug. She leaned in, her lips just inches from the mesh head of the microphone, and whispered a few words. Her voice was so quiet, so fragile, that she wasn't sure if he would even hear it over the fading applause. The host frowned, leaning closer. "What was that, sweetheart?" "Speak up," she repeated herself, her eyes still closed. The song title, she whispered a little louder this time. "It's called The Silence of the Water." He pulled back, a blank look on his face. He had never heard of it. Of course he hadn't. It wasn't on any of the standard karaoke lists. It wasn't a pop hit or a rock anthem. It was a ghost. He shrugged, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. This wasn't part of his plan. He wanted something easy, something predictable. But he was a professional, and the show must go on. He turned to the small, cluttered booth at the side of the stage where the sound guy sat. A man with a long beard and a perpetually bored expression. "Dave, you got The Silence of the Water?" The sound guy, whose name was not Dave, but who answered to it anyway, squinted at his computer screen. He typed for a moment, then shook his head. The host sighed dramatically, turning back to the crowd. "All right, folks, a bit of an obscure choice from our mysterious Eleanor. A deep cut. Let's see if we can find it for her." He was trying to spin it to make it seem like an artistic choice, a moment of intrigue rather than a technical problem. But the crowd was getting restless. They had been promised a spectacle, a laugh. This was turning into a delay. The chatter started to rise again, a low, impatient rumble. A few people shouted out suggestions for other songs. "Just sing Sweet Caroline." One man yelled. Eleanor stood there, frozen, her hands still gripping the microphone stand. She was an island in the middle of a growing storm of impatience. She could feel their collective boredom, their desire for her to just get on with it or get off the stage. The host was trying to stall, telling a bad joke about the difficulties of the music business. But it was falling flat. He was losing control of the room, and he didn't like it. He shot Eleanor an angry look, as if this were her fault. Finally, the sound guy gave a thumbs up. He had found it. On a file-sharing site, buried in a folder of forgotten folk songs, he had located a digital copy. The host, visibly relieved, clapped his hands together. "Found it. All right, Eleanor. From the top, let's hear what you've got." He backed away again, retreating to the side of the stage, his arms crossed once more. His expression was now one of challenge. "Go on," he seemed to be saying. "Impress me. Or, more likely, fail spectacularly." A hush fell over the room as the first notes came through the speakers. It wasn't what anyone expected. There was no thumping bass, no electric guitar riff. It was just a single, haunting piano melody. The notes were simple, spaced far apart, each one ringing out with a clear, melancholic beauty that felt completely out of place in the noisy, warm pub. It was a cold sound. The sound of a winter's night, the sound of loneliness. The mood in the room shifted instantly. The impatient energy dissolved, replaced by a sense of confusion. People looked at each other, their eyebrows raised. What was this? Eleanor stood perfectly still, her eyes closed. She was no longer in the gilded mug. She was somewhere else, a place only she could see. Her hand still gripped the stand, but her grip had loosened. Her shoulders, which had been hunched up around her ears in a permanent state of anxiety, began to relax. The piano intro played on, a simple, repeating pattern that was both beautiful and deeply sad. The crowd was silent now, but it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of bewilderment. They had been prepared for a joke, and they were being given a eulogy. Then, she opened her mouth. The first note came out, and it was not a small, timid sound. It was not the shaky, off-key warble they had been expecting. It was pure. It was clear. It was a sound that seemed to have no business coming from a woman who looked so small and fragile. It filled the room, cutting through the stale air and the smell of fried food, wrapping itself around every single person in the pub. The note was so perfect, so full of aching, profound sorrow, that it felt like a physical touch. A woman in the front, who had been holding her phone up to record, slowly lowered it, her mouth slightly agape. A group of men at the bar, who had been laughing loudly just moments before, fell silent, their glasses halfway to their lips. The smirks vanished. The knowing smiles disappeared. The sound was not just a voice. It was a story. It was the sound of a deep and ancient pain, a grief that had been held in check for years and was finally being allowed to breathe. It was a voice that had seen things, dark things, and had carried the memory of them in silence. The host, who had been leaning against the speaker with a look of bored skepticism, straightened up, his arms uncrossing and falling to his sides. He stared at the woman on the stage, his expression one of complete and utter shock. This was not the performance he had orchestrated. This was something else entirely. This was real. And as the first note faded and the second one began, a chilling realization began to dawn on the crowd. They had come here for fun. They had forced a shy woman to sing for their amusement. But the woman who was singing now was not shy. She was something else entirely. And the song she was singing was not for them. It was for her. And as the full weight of her voice settled over the room, a single, unified thought passed through the minds of the 100 people in the pub. We have made a terrible mistake. The silence that followed the first note was not an empty one. It was a heavy, weighted thing, thick with unasked questions. The piano continued its simple, haunting pattern, each note a drop of cold water in a still pool. Eleanor's eyes remained closed, her face a mask of serene concentration, as if she were the only person left in the world. And in a way she was. She had retreated so deep into herself that the pub, the crowd, the host, all of it had faded away, leaving only the music and the memory it carried. Then she began to sing the first verse. Her voice, that same pure and sorrowful instrument, wove through the piano melody. The lyrics were simple, painted with the broad strokes of a memory. The summer sun was high and bright, she sang, on the day we went to play. By the old quarry, green and deep, we whiled the hours away. A few people in the crowd shifted in their seats. The lyrics were generic, the kind of thing you'd find in any folk song. But there was something in the way she sang them, a specific, tangible quality that made the images feel real. You could almost feel the heat of that sun. See the deep green water of the quarry, the host, who had been standing with his arms crossed. A look of professional appraisal on his face found his posture softening. The smirk was gone, replaced by a furrow of brow. This was not a performance he could categorize. It wasn't good in a technical sense, not like the rock god from before. It was something else. It was true. And truth was a commodity he rarely encountered in his line of work. He looked out at the crowd, trying to gauge their reaction, but he saw only confusion mirrored on 100 faces. They had come for a laugh, and they were being given a lament. They didn't know how to process it. As the verse continued, the lyrics became more specific, or grounded in a place and time that was starting to feel uncomfortably familiar to some of the older patrons. "A boy with hair the color of corn," she sang, her voice trembling slightly on the word corn. He laughed and skipped a stone. He said, "I bet I can touch the other side," though we all knew he was alone. A man in his late 60s, sitting at the far end of the bar, slowly put his glass down. He stared at the rows of liquor bottles, but he wasn't seeing them. He was seeing a different place, a different time. He remembered a boy with corn-colored hair. Everyone had. The boy was a local legend, a sad one. The piano melody shifted, becoming more insistent, more minor key. Eleanor's voice grew stronger, filling every corner of the room. The friend who had pushed her onto the stage was now staring, her hand covering her mouth. Her eyes were wide with a dawning, horrified understanding. This wasn't a song. This was a story. a specific story, and she was beginning to remember the whispers, the things people said when they thought no one was listening. She had been too young to really understand at the time, but the memory was there, buried under years of normal life. And now, Eleanor was digging it up. The song moved into the pre-chorus, the tempo quickening slightly, a sense of panic building in the music. The other children dared him on, Eleanor sang, her voice rising with a barely contained tremor of rage and pain. Their laughter sharp and loud. They dared him to the highest ledge, beneath a thundercloud. She paused, letting the piano hang on a dissonant chord, the sound vibrating through the silent room. And I just watched. I just stood there. I didn't make a sound. The admission hung in the air, a raw, open wound. A collective indrawn breath swept through the pub. This was no longer a performance. It was a confession. And then came the chorus. It was a surge of sound, a wave of pure, unadulterated anguish that crashed over the room. The melody soared, and Eleanor's voice, stripped of all its previous fragility, became a weapon. But it's the silence of the water that haunts me to this day. She sang, her voice cracking with the force of the emotion. It's the silence of the ones who saw and turned and walked away. It's the silence of the laughter that stopped before he fell. It's the silence of the secret we all promised not to tell. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The spell was broken, but not in the way the host had intended. The crowd was no longer a single unified entity. It shattered into 100 individual pieces, each person locked in their own private hell. The man at the bar who remembered the boy with the corn-colored hair squeezed his eyes shut. He had been there that day. He had been one of the older kids. He hadn't dared the boy, but he hadn't stopped it either. He had just watched. A woman in a booth, who was laughing with her friends just 10 minutes ago, suddenly went pale. Her name had been mentioned in the local paper at the time. She had been one of the children there. She had run home and told her mother that the boy had slipped, that it was a terrible accident. She had left out the part about the dares, the part about the other kids pushing him to show off. She had been 10 years old, and she had been scared. For 40 years she had lived with that omission. The host stood frozen, his microphone hanging limply in his hand. He was new to town, but he had heard the stories, the old rumors about a boy at the quarry and a cover-up. He had always dismissed it as small-town gossip. But now, hearing it sung in this voice of absolute, undeniable truth, he felt sick to his stomach. He looked at Eleanor, no longer seeing a shy woman he could bully for a cheap laugh. He saw a witness. He saw a survivor. And he saw the instrument of a reckoning he had accidentally orchestrated. The song continued. The verses painting an even more vivid, more damning picture. They said he slipped. They said he fell. She sang, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow louder than a shout. They wrote it in the report. A tragic accident, a story to tell, to comfort his poor mother's heart. She looked out at the crowd for the first time. Her eyes opened now, and they were not the eyes of a shy woman. They were hard and clear, and they swept across the room, seeming to look into every single person's soul. But his mother knew, and I know. And you know, she sang, her voice rising again on the final line, pointing a finger not at any one person, but at all of them. We all know. The guilt in the room was a physical presence. It was in the way people couldn't meet her gaze. It was in the way they stared into their drinks, as if the answers to all their problems were at the bottom of the glass. It was in the way a few people quietly got up and walked to the door, unable to bear the weight of the memory any longer. They had come to the Gilded Mug for a night of fun, to escape their lives for a few hours. Instead, they had been forced to confront the very worst parts of them, parts they had locked away and hoped would never see the light of day. Eleanor, with her quiet voice and her sad song, had found the key and had turned the lock. The regret was not just instant. It was absolute, and it was suffocating. The final note of the song hung in the air, a single, pure sound that seemed to absorb all the light and all the noise in the room. It was not a note that faded away gradually. It was a clean, sharp cut, and after it, there was nothing. The silence that followed was not the quiet anticipation of an audience waiting for applause. It was a vacuum. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a secret that had been shouted from the rooftops, leaving everyone breathless and exposed. For a full 10 seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the low hum of the beer coolers behind the bar and the faint, phantom echo of the piano melody that seemed to be imprinted on the very walls of the pub. The host stood frozen, his hand still gripping his own microphone, but he had forgotten it was there. His face, usually a mobile mask of easy charm and feigned enthusiasm, was now a blank slate. His eyes were wide, fixed on the woman on the stage. He had wanted a spectacle, a moment of cheap, hilarious humiliation. He had gotten something else entirely. He had summoned a ghost, and it was now staring back at him through the body of this quiet, unassuming woman. He felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He had not just orchestrated a bad night of entertainment. He had orchestrated a public exorcism, and he was suddenly, terrifyingly aware that he was not the priest, but a mere member of the possessed congregation. Eleanor stood with her eyes closed for a long moment after the last note had vanished. She seemed to be swaying slightly, not with the rhythm of any music, but with the sheer weight of the memory she had just unleashed. Then, slowly, she opened her eyes. They were clear and dry, but they held a profound, ancient weariness. She looked out at the crowd, not with anger or triumph, but with a kind of sad, final resignation. She had done what she had been forced to do. She had given them their song. With a slow, deliberate movement, she unhooked the microphone from its stand. She held it for a moment, her fingers wrapped around the cool metal, and then she placed it carefully back into its clip. The soft click it made as it settled into place was the loudest sound in the room. She did not bow. She did not acknowledge the host or the stunned silence. She simply turned her back to the room and walked down the 3 steps at the side of the stage. Her journey back to her booth was the opposite of her walk to the stage. This time the crowd did not watch her with mocking anticipation. They recoiled. As she passed, people looked down at their hands, at their drinks, at the sticky patterns on the tables. They could not meet her gaze. It was as if she were carrying a contagion, a terrible truth that they were all desperate not to catch. A path seemed to open for her, a silent parting sea of shame. She walked through it, her head held high, her posture no longer hunched and defensive, but straight and unbowed. She was no longer the shy woman in the corner. She was the keeper of a terrible story. She had just shared it with everyone. Her friend was still in the booth, her face ashen, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up as Eleanor approached, her eyes filled with a mixture of horror and a dawning, gut-wrenching guilt. She opened her mouth to say something, an apology, an explanation, anything but the words would not come. What could she possibly say? "I'm sorry I forced you to relive the most traumatic moment of your life for the amusement of a bunch of drunk people." The words were absurd, pathetic. So she just sat there, her mouth agape, tears welling in her eyes as she watched the person she thought she knew sit down across from her. Eleanor did not look at her. She just picked up her cardigan from the seat beside her and slid it on. The simple, domestic gesture was strangely out of place in the charged, surreal atmosphere of the pub. She then reached into her purse, pulled out a few bills, and placed them on the table to pay for her soda. It was an act of such profound normalcy that it was more heartbreaking than any dramatic outburst could have been. She was settling her bill, closing her tab, ending her part in this awful night as she stood to leave. Her friend finally found her voice, a choked, desperate whisper. "Eleanor." "I didn't know." Eleanor stopped. She turned and looked at her friend, really looked at her for the first time that night. Her gaze was not accusatory, but it was deeply, profoundly sad. "No one ever asks," she said softly. Her voice was quiet, but it carried clearly across the silent booth. "They just see a quiet person and think they're empty. They're not empty. They're just full of things no one wants to hear." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving her friend to stare at the money on the table, a payment for a debt that could never be repaid. The rest of the pub remained in a state of suspended animation. The host, finally finding a semblance of control, cleared his throat. The sound was loud and awkward. "Well," he began, his voice cracking slightly, that was something else. Let's take a short break. He fumbled with the microphone, then practically fled the stage, disappearing into the back office. Leaving his kingdom without a king? Slowly, hesitantly, the spell began to break. People started talking, but not in the loud, boisterous way they had before. Their voices were low, hushed, conspiratorial. An old man who had been sitting at the bar for 40 years slowly slid off his stool. He placed a crumpled bill next to his empty glass, nodded once to the bartender, and walked out the door. His shoulders stooped with a weight that seemed heavier than before. A group of women who had been laughing together earlier now sat in silence, their arms crossed, avoiding each other's eyes, each lost in their own memories of that summer, that boy. That Quarry, the friend, sat alone in the booth, the tears now streaming freely down her face. She looked at the empty stage, at the microphone stand, where Eleanor had left her mark. She understood now. The shyness wasn't a personality quirk. It was a fortress. It was a wall built brick by brick with grief and guilt. A wall designed to keep the terrible memories in and the cruel, curious world out. And tonight, she had helped a crowd of drunken strangers tear that wall down. She had not been helping her friend. She had been helping herself to a piece of her pain. The regret was a physical taste in her mouth, bitter and sharp. Outside, Eleanor walked into the cool night air. The street was quiet, a stark contrast to the silent chaos she had just left behind. She did not run. She did not hurry. She just walked, her footsteps echoing on the empty pavement. She felt a strange sense of lightness, as if a great, heavy stone that had been lodged in her chest for decades had finally been dislodged. It didn't mean the pain was gone. It didn't mean the memory was erased. But it was no longer a secret she had to carry alone. She had given it away, piece by piece, note by note, to 100 people who would now have to learn to carry it. She was still a quiet person. She would always be a quiet person. But tonight, for the first time in a very long time, her silence felt like a choice, not a prison. It was a silence she could step into and out of, a place of rest rather than a place of hiding. She had been forced to sing, and in doing so, she had found a voice she never knew she had. And as she disappeared into the shadows of the sleeping town, she left behind a room full of people who would never again think of a shy woman in the corner as someone who was just waiting for a little push. They would think of her, and they would remember the sound of her voice. They would understand the terrible, beautiful weight of a silence that was finally and irrevocably broken.